Ooh, okay, so he's preparing to go live. And I believe you're now live, Caroline. Over to you.
Super. Good afternoon. I'm Caroline and I'm the Director of Achates, a strategy and fundraising and recruitment company focusing on the charitable sector, which I founded 7 years ago. We're called Achates because in the Aeneid, Achates was the loyal advisor and friend who told the truth. And that describes the exact relationship we like to have with our clients. And we're lucky enough to have amongst our clients the King's Head. So when our good friends asked us to present a presentation on fundraising, the first to date, I think, in KHTOnline, that's where I wanted to begin. Because it seems to me that really having that honest understanding, that essential knowledge with regards to fundraising, which frankly is rarely explained and kind of hard to understand from the outside, I thought that's what I'd really like to use this session to do, is to try and give you 10 key points, which are the essentials you need to know about fundraising as an artist. And I hope they're going to save you quite a bit of time and energy as a result. I think we've got time for questions at the end if you want to share any. And if you think of things after, I know that you're always welcome to email me at caroline@achatesphilanthropy.com. So let's talk about fundraising essentials for artists and think about an audience-informed approach in particular. Point 1, the freedom of the artist, the liberty of the arts organisation. So, as creatives, you've trained and developed in approaches which are required for making great art. One in which the creative process and not the audience is at the centre. That's right and appropriate to the creative process itself. The challenge is that once you step outside of the rehearsal room and start to think as an arts organisation, how you will present and share that work, that approach needs to change. And because we have such limited spaces in this country to discuss and explore cultural policy, and because we tend to follow ACE's guidance, as a result, we don't often fully understand the issues underpinning our policy and approach. Arts organisations are the mechanism which connect audiences with art. And whilst for a long period in the 20th and early 21st century, UK arts organisations were excellent at curating and creating art, unfortunately, they were also quite poor at thinking about and connecting to audiences. And as a result, the privilege and power that comes with art subsidy was perhaps accessible only to a few individuals who came from a largely homogenous group, which were white, upper middle class, privately educated, Southern and male. So not an awful lot of intersectionality going on there. We're living and working at a time when the rights and freedoms of creatives and the cultural sector are under extreme pressure, with a government that's increasingly focused on controlling the cultural narrative and our cultural identities. So what model should arts organisations be seeking whilst maintaining the right of the artist to artistic expression and engagement at a time like this? Well, I'd really like you to think about the philosopher John Locke's theory of liberty in this, because what's really useful about his ideas is that he differentiates the ideas of freedom and the ideas of liberty. And the idea that whilst freedom primarily concerns the expression of free will, liberty requires a responsible use of freedom without impinging on the freedom of the others. So one is absolutely about freedom of expression and free will, and one is about the responsibility that comes with freedom. I would perhaps suggest to you that in the rehearsal room or the studio, the freedom of the artist is paramount and must be allowed to have expression to make great art. The artwork in development doesn't impinge on the liberties of anyone because it's in the closed space of the studio of the rehearsal room. And so there must be the freedom to experiment and fail while creating art. But it's different when it comes to connecting with audiences. And the arts organisation has a responsibility to think about the rights of the audiences and who owns and engages with art. Of course, when you're presenting that work as an artist, what you've got to try and do is marry those two things together. Now, what on earth has all that got to do with fundraising, you might ask? I suppose I would try and argue to you that most funding is a product and manifestation of cultural policy. So it's really important that we understand the landscape of cultural policy that we're operating in, why it works as it does, and then we can choose how we wish to respond to it. Not everything that is available to you you'll want to engage in, and you'll want to take a particular position that reflects your identity as artists and the distinctiveness of your companies in your response to that landscape. So thinking about this, I'd really like you to think about a parallel time in history to today. Many of you will be aware of someone called Nye Bevan as the driving force behind the creation of the NHS. And of course, the creation of the NHS was one of the key developments that came out of the end of the Second World War, and a real period of national reflection on the kind of society we want to live in and the values we want to uphold after a period of great national trauma. But some of you perhaps won't be surprised to hear that, as is often the way, there stood alongside Nye Bevan, a woman of equal importance who not only campaigned with him for the NHS, but was the driving force behind the Arts Council and the subsidised arts sector as we know it today, his wife, Jenny Lee. Jenny Lee's first white paper as the first arts minister, some 19 years after the Arts Council itself was created in 1946, and the introduction of a system for the national funding of art and its institutions, marked a new era in our cultural landscape, which has led to the development of thousands of artists and the creation of hundreds of arts organisations across the country, particularly with the introduction of local government authorisation to fund arts, which came through in 1948. But essentially, we're talking about 70 years of history. It's not very long in which the cultural sector as we know it today has existed. So although it's only just 70 years since the creation of the NHS and that movement towards the Arts Council as we know it today, the policy of state funding for the arts is absolutely ingrained in our psyche and our thinking, just as the NHS is. They both came out of that same moment. We all think about it in that similar way. And just as Jenny Lee was at the heart of our post-war national social policy, we have now to think about why perhaps we don't feel about the arts as we do about the NHS. So whilst the NHS perhaps has always borne the responsibility of ensuring it genuinely is a service for any citizen of this country, the arts as a sector perhaps has not always been so successful as that. And so for those outside of the sector, whether working in it or regularly, actively engaging in it, some people may not hold the arts and cultural sector in that same regard as those of us that work and participate in it regularly. The issue of diversity and inclusion in the arts organisations has been on the agenda now for almost 30 years. And still today, it remains a key tension, with the cultural engagement rates reflected in Arts Council England's Taking Part survey not having increased substantially since the millennium. And whilst arts organisations have been encouraged to consider such issues, in too many cases, it is linking this issue with funding that has ultimately forced a change, but funding has played a positive dynamic. Today, in the light of social justice movements such as Black Lives Matter, we see it's really come to the top of the agenda. 3, let's think about art as charitable. It's also important to understand that because of that historic context in which art was funded by the state, and that we understand art largely from a public perspective today, it's really important that we appreciate the fact that art was only made legally a charitable object, so something that a charity could exist to support and actively promote in the late 20th century. And most of our long-standing arts organisations are actually constituted as educational charities as a result. So art was paid for by the state. The charitable element was the social engagement, the education, the outreach work that sort of happened on the end at that time is how it was perceived. So this is why, in this context, there are really few charities that fund art directly, because most of them have existed since before art was made charitable. And for them they couldn't have had art as one of their charitable objects because it wouldn't have been legal. And in any case, they would have been duplicating the role of the state if they'd have done that. So most arts funders, as you will be thinking of them today, focus on the social impact of the work because of these twin historical events that have happened. So the context of charitable funding and the poor performance of arts organisations in thinking about audiences, pushing us even further towards that today. So having established this landscape of how art has been funded, and is probably still largely understood by the public as being funded, the charitable context of there not being lots of charities that fund just art, because why would they do that? It wasn't legal and it wasn't needed. Then we can start to think about where charities and funders are putting their money and the emphasis, particularly in our current context and the powerful communication of social justice movements. So let's think about an audience-informed approach. Once you've understood that landscape, it becomes much easier, I think, to understand why it's really critical to have what we at Achates call an audience-informed approach. By this, we mean having a clear understanding of the audiences you serve, both people who are paying to engage and those who are being subsidised to engage, and really acknowledging that you cannot successfully serve everyone. You simply don't have the resources to do so. And hyperbole, such as great art for everyone, is super and powerful in many ways, but it's not the practical reality of any but the very few organisations. Most organisations, and certainly most likely the ones that you work and have established, are really going to have to think carefully about who genuinely you can support and engage. And there's a really interesting tension in this, in that you want to have, as an arts organisation, a mix, a balance of people who are paying to engage and are perhaps buying tickets to your shows, and groups that you are perhaps fundraising to take work out to, the education engagement part of that work. And because we're placing ourselves within society, as opposed to art being above society and looking down on it, we want to have an interesting dynamic and conversation between those groups. We don't want it to be the rich people paying for the people who can't pay and a hierarchy there. And that's a really important thing for you as a company to be thinking about what your relationship to those audiences is and what your manifestation of that is in your work. And of course, if you only have paying audiences, you wouldn't be able to meet your purposes as a charity. You wouldn't even be able to get money from the Arts Council, let's face it, because you have to have that wider public engagement work. And if everything is absolutely subsidised, you're going to have a really efficient fundraising model, because it's going to be challenging to survive because you're not earning any income. So you've got that hierarchy to consider, but you've also got that balance between art, audiences and money, and that dynamic for you as a company that you've got to establish and really make sure is strong. And that commitment to audiences you prioritise the ones that you specifically, all of you in your company can list, and your board, if you have one, can list too, and your audience you should be aware of, saying, oh yeah, this community, this organization, they work really closely together, they've got this great relationship. Well, that commitment to those audience groups needs to be medium term, because a one-off performance isn't really going to drive meaningful change. It might create moments of joy, but what funders are really trying to look for is to invest in change for those audience groups of a variety of kinds. And that requires a medium-term approach. Now, I really understand that that's different than the approach that many touring theatre companies have held for many years. How do you have a sustained commitment that can bring real impact to audiences and communities when you're a touring company? And I think it's something that you've really got to give careful consideration to. But I would say that, for example, you might notice that perhaps all of the art collectives nominated for this year's Turner Prize, for example, none of them has a building, but all of them are grounded in a community or a place to which they have a commitment. And that's no coincidence that that's being celebrated at Turner Prize level. It's about saying this is a value and approach to art which particularly fits where we are as a society and makes real sense. So as an arts organisation, we need to create a balanced model for ourselves, what I call a balanced three-legged stool. You've got art, you've got audiences and money in harmony. And the dynamic for you as an arts organisation in the balance in that three-legged stool is really critical. So if you have a particularly high art offer, you're obviously perhaps going to initially at least find it challenging to reach audiences and really get more challenging work across. So you might need more subsidy and you might need to think about where that's going to come from. Whereas if you have a more commercial approach, you're probably going to raise more money on tickets. So your subsidy might be less and your social impact might be less. So you've really got to understand and think carefully for yourself how that's working. In order to achieve this, you need a really clear sense of your organisational purpose, what it is you exist to do. Now, people have traditionally used vision and mission statements to do this, but I increasingly find them not that helpful, if I'm really honest. I find them a little bit linguistic games that don't really give you a clarity. And it makes me laugh when I sort of see totally different organisations that have got really similar vision and mission statements. I just think, well, they're not really helping you do that job. So, and quite often they're not done right either. I mean, a vision is meant to be your vision of the world that you're trying to bring about, and your mission is your specific job within bringing that vision of the world about. 9 times out of 10, they're the wrong way round, and the other time out of 10, it doesn't really tell you about the company anyway. So what we tend to use instead is what we call a statement of purpose. And a statement of purpose sets a clear frame of an articulation of who you are as an organisation and what you exist to do, that hopefully everyone can own and understand. And it isn't just about memorising the exact words that were in the vision and mission. It's just this is what we're for. And you can all carry a version of that. And once you can articulate what you are for, the work you want to make to achieve that, it's then possible to consider the balance in your three-legged stool in your approach to audiences you want to work with. Okay, 5, resilience with integrity. The other reason this sense of purpose is so vital to fundraising is because no one wants to be funding led. And whilst in the short term, opportunism can help address an immediate problem or crisis, in the medium term, I think we all know that it risks organisational drift and as a result, irrelevance. And that's not why any of you are working in the sector. So ironically, in my experience, and I've been a fundraiser for 25 years, very few fundraisers really want you to be funding led. That isn't what fundraising is about. Good fundraisers know that arts organisations with a strong sense of self, a strong statement of purpose, and a strong brand that reflects that, and an idea of itself that everyone can own and articulate, which allows audiences to feel close to that organisation as a result, those are the ones that are successful, because we're clear in who they are, what they're doing, and we can decide if we align ourselves to it, and the relationship's just really positive and dynamic as a result. I worked with the Arts Council for 6 years on 2 programmes designed to support arts organisations in growing their fundraising. In that time, those 6 years, BOP Consulting and Achates worked with over 500 arts organisations across the UK of all scales. And we statistically proved across those 500 arts organisations that these factors are central to fundraising success. So that sense of purpose, being very clear what you're for, and that sense of that being reflected in your mission, vision, if you choose to have them, or in your brand, in your statement of purpose as you choose to communicate it, and that really coming through to audiences clearly, that's what makes fundraising strong. We've proved it. So at Achates, our strapline is resilience with integrity, because we believe that understanding and owning our organisational purpose and being honest and clear about which audiences we're making a genuine commitment to, it's not saying that you won't ever work with other audience groups, it's just these are the ones you're particularly focusing on and making a commitment to. That enables us to further our artistic policy and our charitable aims in a way which both has integrity and supports fundraising. And I guess, having worked all those years in the cultural sector, what I really believe is if you have that approach, fundraising doesn't become such a burden anymore, because it isn't that thing that you're sticking on the end of what you're doing. It just becomes part of what you're doing. And that's a much more positive way to be working. So let's talk about funding policy now. So I've outlined a little bit about the historic context of why we've got to the funding landscape that we have. And whether or not you think that's right, that almost isn't the point, if I'm honest. What's really important is that you understand that arts policy, and then you can make a choice about where you want to position yourself within it, so that you can really have your fundraising reflecting the ethos of your organisation. Now, some people may see the situation that I've outlined as an argument for a return to full state funding. I suppose what I would say is that I would argue that when we had privilege, when we had as close to full state funding as has ever been, what worries me is that we didn't use that privilege well. And as I've said, the power that that state funding brought wasn't used responsibly by the sector. So I guess for me, where I've ended up on this argument is that the ideal model would be a system with a high level of state funding that was growing as opposed to declining, as it is now, and it's likely to be cut further, I would suggest, in the period ahead. And I would like to see that creating the opportunity for artists and arts organisations to play and take risks in their early years in particular. And then on the other side, I'd like to see a plentiful level of cultural philanthropy, which sits within a cultural system that's really respected and values gifts of all levels. So rather than focusing on a few very rich individuals, actually thinking about a system where the pound from the participant is equally meaningful. And then I'd like to see both of those things in a landscape with higher tax rates for high income earners, so that philanthropy doesn't have excessive levels of influence. Now, that's my dream scenario, but the reality is, as I've said, is that we don't have that situation. State funding is declining in real terms. In England, there is 545 million in voluntary income for culture across the UK. So by that, what I mean is trusts, corporate sources and individual donations. And whilst that 545 million, that figure's from 2019, represents a growth on the last data set from 2016, that growth is largely in individual giving, which is the income source most closely linked with the capital, with London, and with a few major brands. So in a cultural economy where 60% of that 545 million, that voluntary income base, goes to the 50 biggest brands, we can see that the system isn't fair. This trend, which the pandemic has exacerbated even further, some of you may have seen that was a report from the Paul Hamlin Foundation, I think the week before last, which showed that the impact of trusts giving to existing funding organisations has meant that 25% of all the money from trusts and foundations went to 10 organisations last year. So what I would argue is, whether you agree with it or not as a policy in terms of where we stand today, it's really important that you understand your place within it, and then you can start to make the arguments that you feel are authentic to you as an organisation. So 7, how do you get funding ready? So what steps do we recommend at Achates that you put yourself in the best place to secure funding by undertaking whilst retaining your integrity? Okay, so here we go. Establish your statement of purpose. Have a look at Battersea Arts Centre's website. They've got a statement of purpose up there. It's quite building heavy, but it gives you an idea of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Secondly, create a balanced list of priority audience groups. I don't mean they've got to have exactly the same numbers of groups that are paying and the groups that are subsidised, but really understand who is it that's engaging with your work on a paid basis, who you're particularly attracting and why, what are they getting from it, what else would they be interested in, and then really think about the groups that you're engaging who wouldn't necessarily just engage with you through coming to a paid experience such as a performance. What are you offering to them, and why are they particularly suitable in terms of engaging and furthering the value of your work? 3, outline what kind of change you want to work with and bring about with those groups. So with the paying audience groups, it may simply be the intrinsic value of art, the joy, the moment of experience, but it may go beyond that because you might be having a digital offering that takes them to a more considered place in the conversation that goes further. Equally, in your subsidised groups, it might be an outcome in mental health. It might be an outcome in social community building. Think very carefully about what change you want to bring about. And then try and capture the distinctiveness of your methodology and approach that you want to use to bring about that change. Now at Achates, we very simply try and do that through logic chains that map out the audience groups that we're working with, their priorities. We prefer to say priorities rather than needs. The things that we can do to help support those priorities, what that methodology looks like, the outputs and the outcomes. And if you can really understand why you're approaching your work in the way that you are, it's very much easier to communicate that on the page. And in fact, that chain that I've just outlined really is the backbone of virtually all contemporary funding bids. At the end of that process, you're going to want to be really clear what the outputs, the numbers, and the outcomes, the change you will bring about are. And then when you've captured that, you can really look at which funders are interested in the same things you are. I think when you're starting out in fundraising, it's really easy, because you're looking at things from your internal perspective, to read the priorities and guidance of every single funding organisation, think, yes, they're for me, or yes, I can make it for me. And yeah, there will be things that you try and match, but ultimately, fundraising is an exchange of values and ideas. It's people investing in the same change that you want to bring about. It's that shared priority. So by laying that out, we find it's much easier to take a sort of cold analytical look at What is it we're doing, and does that fit with what the funder's trying to do? And then you're not wasting your time writing endless funding bids that frankly probably won't be successful. And you're doing it in the structured argument way that they want to see. One of the biggest funders in this country said to me recently, Caroline, all I ever want to know is, who are you? What are you doing? Who are you doing it for? What's the change you're trying to bring about, and what does that look like as success? And that's the logic chain that I've just described. And that's one of the big foundations that simply said, that's what we need to know. And the last point I want to make in terms of being funding ready is really saying, try not to make a cold approach. So lots of the funders will be really clear on whether or not you're allowed to contact them in advance. So for example, someone like the John Ellerman Foundation is brilliant and says, absolutely, you can arrange for a call. Paul Hamlin has been brilliant in recent months in terms of really offering, particularly for smaller organizations, pre-calls that you can make. Other foundations such as Esme Fairbairn are very, very clear that you can't do that, and they have more delineated processes. So you've got to be very conscious of that. And I'm not saying ring a funder cold if they're very clear that you shouldn't do that. But what I'm saying is that you should try and make some kind of awareness and contact in advance. And even if that's very difficult for you to cultivate someone like that as a very small organization, think about a covering letter that could go with your bid if you haven't had a chance to contact them in advance. Sometimes that might just be from another organisation that they're already funding and like and admire the work of. But I can tell you that when I was Chief Executive of Penn International, I was very fortunate to have a committee of eminent writers that I put together. And if one of those eminent writers signed that cover letter, I'd get the money. If they didn't, I didn't. And you have to understand that for many of these funders, essentially, they can't keep an eye on who everybody is in the landscape. Lots of these big foundations that you think, gosh, they're really big and powerful, they probably have a very limited staff team. Something like the Foyle Foundation has less than 5. Something like Garfield Weston only has a team of less than 10. So you've got actually a situation where it's very difficult for them to really know who are these important companies that we should be investing in. So anything you can do to give yourselves a heads up is really valuable there. Much of Arts Council England's cultural policy is in fact really close to that original white paper that Jenny Lee wrote that I mentioned right back from the 1960s. What's interesting is that it's got an increased emphasis on principles which relate to independent income generation, such as dynamism. So basically what it is saying, okay, the principles remain the same from that same time, that parallel moment of time and change, but we've got to compensate for the fact that we haven't been good in including diverse audiences and giving diverse artists power. And so we need to address that. And equally, the landscape isn't the one that Jenny hoped for. So we've really got to encourage arts organisations to think about making money as well as earning money, because unfortunately, whilst that voluntary income is growing, it's not growing at the pace at which the state subsidy is falling away. So most arts organisations are probably going to need some form of commercial income. And of course, this for you as theatre companies is something you're thinking about all the time, but for lots of the arts organisations, they may not be charging for their experiences in the same way. So they have to think again about that. So know your context, know your role, know your purpose, know who you're working with and what you are helping them to achieve. And finally, be really ready to articulate the change that you're bringing about as an arts organisation as a result. It's also really worth knowing that these tools, once you have them, are the basis of not only your funding bids, but a really strong business plan, which will help you deliver your aims sustainably. Now, what I would say is that that the business plan, as it's expressed in the Arts Council's terms, is something that we don't think really will help you run your company well. And we actually find that it's often independent arts organisations that have the best business plans because they have to have all these elements in it. At Achates, we've developed a helpful infographic which helps show all these things and how they come together in a business plan. It's going to be on our website very soon, but if you'd like a copy of that, just let us know and we'll share that with you. Or indeed, I'm sure our friends at the King's Head will as well, because I know that they've got it. So moving on to point 8, where does value lie? Once you understand and can articulate these elements for your organisation, you can start to understand and articulate the value of your work of your organisation and match these against the priorities of funders. So let me explain what I mean. 6 years ago, I founded a prize, the Achates Philanthropy Prize, which celebrates and promotes the idea that anyone, not just wealthy people, but that anyone can be an arts philanthropist. In 2020, we pivoted the focus of the prize and we paid a young arts professional in each region of England, and then one in Scotland, one in Wales and Northern Ireland, to research and collect 15 case studies in their region of really great practice as to how the arts had responded to their communities during the pandemic and how their communities had responded in return. Now, having that body of 120 case studies was a really great way to think about the different ways in which the arts was driving value in this time and how it's making a contribution to society. Now, in that process, we identified 8 types of value, which might be helpful to you in trying to think about and express the ways in which your work and art has value. So number 1, intrinsic. And I think, frankly, all of your projects, all of your activities for all of you will have intrinsic value. The sheer quality and value of art in our lives, something that is a fundamental human right and essential to a healthy society, and which is fundamentally hard to quantify. But that's another session in itself. Economic value. This is a type of value that we've made all our arguments to the government about in recent times, very much about the economic value of the cultural sector, the cultural industries. I think that's worked with the government to a certain extent, but I would also argue that by using just that type of value in our arguments is why the money has gone to arts organisations rather than going to individual artists, because they've invested in the drivers of economic value, because that's the basis on which the argument was made. Next, mental health, then physical health, social benefit, so that might be working with a particular group, such as people with lived experience of homelessness and thinking about their social welfare. And then there's wider community building, that idea of community groups coming together through culture at a time like this. Innovation, actually quite a few projects that had technological innovation built within them. Let's face it, we've all changed our relationship to technology over the last 15 months. And then finally, of our 8 types of value is educational value. So it's really important, as I say, that you understand where you sit with those types of value. And then when you're articulating that benefit, it's really clear. Now, one of the points which I think is rarely made is that certain types of art are particularly well suited to certain types of impact and value. So it's obvious, for example, that dance is particularly well suited to physical well-being, as opposed to literature, for example. Music is particularly valuable in terms of supporting mental health, whereas a lot of the technological innovation we've seen is in the performing arts or in the visual arts. Identifying your impact will help you focus on funders who are looking to achieve the same things you are. And remember, fundraising is, as I say, not about asking for money. It's about finding individuals and organisations who are looking to achieve the same things you are, and together bringing about a change. Okay, so you've articulated the types of value that you're bringing. What next? Well, without doubt, because funders are looking to invest in you making a change, they're also going to be super keen on you evaluating and learning from that work. And what I tend to find is that we tend to think about, first of all, monitoring and not evaluation. So we tend to count numbers, but not tend to think about whether our projects are working as effectively as they could do, and whether there's more that could be done to learn and develop to make them stronger. And we tend to think about it too late. So we tend to think about evaluation at the point that we need to begin monitoring numbers, and that's too late if we need to measure a change from where we are now to the place we're trying to get to be. But because you'll have a clear understanding of your purpose, your audiences, their priorities, what you can do to support them in addressing them, what the outputs, outcomes, and the impact and the value of your work is from this process, it's now really easy to plan the evaluation of your work. And evaluation is important, as I say, because a funder is investing in you to bring about medium-term change, and they need to see that that investment in you is having an impact through evaluation. So the form your evaluation will take follows the methodology you take in your work and the type of value you're trying to bring about. So if your focus is on educational benefit, then you're going to look at the confidence and the performance of the groups you're working with before, during, and after your program. If your focus is community building, let's say, then the surveys that look at how you connected a community feels before you start work, during the program, and after the work is going to take place is going to make most sense for you. So the evaluation just follows the nature of the work that you're doing and the type of value you're trying to drive. So in short, all of these different elements that we've discussed should connect together for planning, fundraising, delivery, and be a learning process for you to build and grow your work and impact as a company. And it will mean that by being strong in these areas, you will be successful in your fundraising. It isn't a level playing field, but this is how you punch beyond those restrictions. So my final point really is that I would always want you to think about arts as part of the society rather than existing outside of it. So it's not going to be successful if it considers itself outside of society, looking down and commenting on it. And in fact, I would suggest to you that that one of the reasons that perhaps politically culture is being used as such an important sort of culture war territory at the present time is because that's the sense that we often get, is that people who are not regularly engaged in culture might feel that it's outside of society, looking down and judging on the rest of society. Successful art for me is, as I say, a human right, something that we own and have responsibility for, all of us, and fundamental to a life well lived. I think it's really interesting to see an organisation like With One Voice, the advocacy group for lived experience of homelessness, using their really beautiful jigsaw of homelessness, which shows how art and culture is fundamental to the recovery of somebody with lived experience of homelessness. And have a look at that jigsaw, I really recommend it, and you'll see housing, employment, you'll see education, you'll see art and culture. And I certainly, when I looked at that jigsaw of homelessness, just thought this is so fantastic as an articulation of why somebody with lived experience of homelessness would really need art and culture in their life. And then I thought again and thought, this is just a life well lived. This is a rich and fulfilled life. So art is part of a society. Too often we face inwards and talk only to each other and to other like-minded organisations. if you're really to engage diverse audiences and play a role in society, you have to look outwards. You must ask and you must listen. And I think that's a really fundamental challenge, is the next stage for arts organisations. I think that very often when we're thinking about these priority audience groups, we will assume that we know what their priorities are and will quite often forget to ask them, which is why I'm placing such an emphasis on that monitoring and evaluation, as well as funders needing it. I think it absolutely is the voice in our conversation that's often missing. So you'll really want to try and be brave and bring people into that conversation. I think the thing to remember is you're not going to do everything that your audience tells you. I refer to it deliberately as an audience-informed approach, as opposed to an audience-led approach. But it's really important that you do know the challenges, the provocations, the priorities of your different audience groups. And I think that will help you really think about making a journey with your audiences over time and growing to be a strong organisation. So I can see that we've got a couple of questions in the chat here, which I shall do my best to try and address. So from Fiona, we've got, I'm interested in your advice around if small theatre companies and organisations should be a charity or a kick. Seems to be quite a bit of debate in this area at the minute. Yeah, it's a really good question, Fiona. And I'll be honest and say, there's a question that, a side note to this, I've specifically raised with the Arts Council, in that I've been working with quite a number of perhaps smaller, diverse-led companies who are doing really brilliant charitable style work, but because they're doing it within a commercial organisation setting, aren't eligible for anything other than state money. And I've been really conscious of the fact that I've basically been forced by our funding landscape to try and encourage them to take what is essentially a white Christian methodology, which is a charity sector structure, just to enable them to take funding. And actually, I was really pleased that when I raised this point with the Arts Council, they did say that it's something they've been thinking about. And whilst some of that thinking about that had been delayed by the pandemic, it was very much on their horizon that this could be an inhibiting factor to particularly diverse grassroots-led groups. It's interesting in terms of CIOs, CICs, KICs and full charities. What I would generally say is that over the period in which I've been in fundraising, I've really seen a slight growth in the number of organisations that will fund CICs. And I think that often, particularly with small film production companies or very early stage theatre companies, they're going for CICs because they feel very nimble and very light touch, but ultimately they are really restricted in terms of where you're going to be able to get money from beyond the Arts Council itself. So it's that question that we always end up saying to people is, if you think in the next medium-term period that you're likely to need charitable money, then beyond the Arts Council and beyond your community of friends, you probably should go for a charitable model. And our experience over the last couple of years of the CIO model has been positive. We're seeing it at organisations as wide-ranging as Arnafini in Bristol is now a CIO. That's working very nicely for them as a light touch model, through to someone like the People's Orchestra in Birmingham, which is a wonderful grassroots-led classical music organisation. And it does work very well, but it is a bigger commitment than the CIC. So I think that what you have to really think about is, are you going to need that money and support in the medium term? The other issue that's really in this, I always just really try and articulate to people, is to really understand that once you have taken on charitable status of any kind, the company is no longer in our control. So we essentially put it into the public domain, and the company obviously owns the intellectual property of that organisation, but it isn't your private property as an individual anymore. And that can be an issue for people, and I completely understand that. And so we try to be very transparent about that point, because it is ultimately your decision. But yeah, if you're only ever going to be working on ticket income and a bit of Arts Council money, and I mean only ever really in the medium term, is that all you're going to need? Then, and a little bit of perhaps crowdfunding, etc., fine to go through the CIC. But if you're going for something more ambitious and you want the company to have medium term legs, it does really push you into that CIO territory at the present time. Next, we've got a question from Simon, which is about stats for the amounts given to theatres through online streaming, etc. It's a really good question, Simon. And no, we don't have the data for that at the present time, but it's going to be really interesting to see how philanthropy has held up through the pandemic. At Achates, we carried out a survey probably about 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago now, because one of the things that we were really conscious of was that actually a number of people, including the Donmar Warehouse, had contacted us and said, we're trying to write our business plan and we've got all the data, you know, for previous years, but we're trying to set a benchmark for the period ahead. And how on earth do we do that? Because of course, none of us has ever been through a scenario quite like this ever before. So we did a bit of a survey that looked back, but hopefully also looked forward and tried to set a benchmark. Now, some really interesting things came out of that. One of the things that came out of it is that the idea of a major donor was by the group that participated in the survey, sort of distinguished at £1,000 plus gift aid level. Anybody who was already a major donor really was dealing with a philanthropic relationship with their arts organisation. And that was really interesting in that they basically stayed with their arts organisation. So what I mean is, in the majority of cases, they weren't having a transactional, a benefits only relationship with the organisation. They were giving the money because they believed in the value and the work of the organisation philanthropically. And those people just continue to give. There's been hardly any drop off of donors at that rate. What was really interesting was the schemes that are particularly transactional, so particularly the lower level membership schemes, and in bigger organisations, the patron schemes, because there was nothing to sell anymore, those people were stopping sometimes their transactional relationship, but giving philanthropically instead. And what was really interesting to me looking at that survey was realizing that the arts organisations were saying, that's brilliant that they've stayed with us, now we're going to try and convert them back to transactional. And I think that's a really long-standing insecurity in the cultural sector, and it's very much related to the origins of our fundraising, in which we didn't really believe that anyone would understand us as being charities that anybody could support, because that wasn't the historical context. That's not how the arts have been funded. So to try and raise money at a time of financial pressure, what the few big arts organisations that really started to fundraise in the 90s did was to invite in a few very wealthy people. So we have this slightly distorted position in the arts, where arts philanthropy is the preserve of a few very wealthy people, as opposed to being the democratized model that I really try to promote and support. And so I think that insecurity about whether people would genuinely understand us as arts organizations is really at the heart of that question. And I think it's also, in fairness, to do with the idea that, that benefits are an efficient way of managing a relationship and keeping it developing over time. And, essentially we feel a lot easier building groups and volumes of people through a transactional relationship. But I would really question whether that's a great way to build a deeper understanding and contact and relationship with your organization over time. I would perhaps think that, that's an opportunity in terms of taking your relationship to the next stage. I had a conversation with Tate before the pandemic where I pointed out to them that I had been a member at whatever it is, £90 a year. You see, I don't even know quite what it is. It tells you that relationship is long-standing. But I've been a member for 20. I spoke to said, oh, are you going to give us some money? And I said, well, you might want to actually form a relationship with me first, because at the present time, that isn't the conversation we've had. We've just had a purely transactional relationship whereby I come to shows and I get essentially pre-buy my tickets in advance. And I'd love to have a more deep relationship with you, but you probably have to put that work in first. And one of the things that, of course, has happened in the pandemic is that because we've not had shows to sell, what we have all done is really move to a much more value-based communication of the impact and worth of our work. We've not been able to only do marketing, we've had to move to communications. And because of that, I think there's a real opportunity for us all to be able to think about how we move our relationship forward with our audiences. So my feeling on this is there's lots of potential, there's lots of new audiences being reached. What we shouldn't just do now is force people who've come through from all sorts of opportunities, and let's face it, King's Head has had a superb public response to its work, you know, through its fundraising in the period. What we don't want to do is force everybody back into the box. Let's make sure that we really try and take the time to understand the potential of those relationships philanthropically going forwards. So I think that might be all our questions. So really great to spend some time with you all this afternoon. Thanks so much. And as I say, if there's questions or things that you'd like to ask, always feel you can email us over at Achates. Thanks so much.